Alright, so this video is going to be about the Age of Discovery, and it's going to leave a couple of things out just because we've already covered Columbus in, quite a bit of detail, but ultimately it's going to be talking about the European exploration into the New World. The first thing I really want to reiterate is just simply that people didn't really believe that the Earth was flat. There might have been some people somewhere that did, but this is quite a bit of a myth. When in reality, that the educated people knew that the Earth was a sphere, and really the thing was is that it was the size of the Earth that people were questioning. They weren't quite sure how big it is around, and that's why Christopher Columbus, who had believed that the Earth was actually much smaller than some other people, was willing to make the journey, hoping that he was going to eventually run into Asia by going west. Obviously, we know he didn't. He ran into what is modern day, what's Hispaniola, which is modern day Cuba, the Bahamas, and such, and ultimately, rediscovered this North American continent and the American continents for Europe, really for Spain. But going before this, you had a bit of a push toward navigation from someone known as Prince Henry, ultimately becoming known as Prince Henry the Navigator in really the mid 1400s. He was this Portuguese prince that is really going to begin pushing this first major exploration of the African coast in particular. So as I said, Prince Henry was a sponsor of these voyages. He was the son of the king. I think he was the fifth son of the king. But with so, he had a bit of money to be able to play around with, and in doing so, he was able to sponsor these trips of these explorers to really mostly explore the coast of Africa. It really interested him for trade for Portugal. So he employed cartographers and geographers and explorers to ultimately map out that coast. These explorers that were that were employed by him were ultimately improving designs of ships. And there is this myth that he had set up this explorer school, which it seems to be a myth that it doesn't actually seem to be. It seems to have been debunked at this point. But it doesn't change, how valuable and how necessary Prince Henry was for getting the ball rolling in this exploration. So some of the things that these explorers were now, using and even building on as they explored. One of these items that they use in these instruments of discovery is simply just the compass. I think most of you probably know what a compass is. I've got a small picture of one here, but ultimately it's this device that allows for this free spinning magnets in here that show kind of the direction based off of the magnetic poles of the Earth. And by obviously showing the directions of the magnetic poles, you then can deduce which direction you are traveling. And that is obviously useful for when you are out in the middle of the ocean and you want to take a straight path to somewhere if you can. So another one of these items used in this exploration is known as an astrolabe, and this is really a pretty awesome little device. It's a pretty old device, and it's got a ridiculous number of functions. I've just listed a couple here. You can actually tell the time with it based off of the celestial bodies, which is really cool. The stars and things like that. You can triangulate distance. You can figure out cardinal directions. You can actually point to the star positions, and in doing so be able to kind of locate the directions that you're also traveling. You can measure altitudes, you can survey things with it, so it really is a pretty incredible little device, and you could call it one of the world's first computers. There's a really great TED Talk on this, that there's a link right there on the bottom, that if you'd really like to know more about this, then you can obviously follow that link, and you'll be able to get right to it. And he describes it in quite a bit more detail than I just did, but it's a really interesting device for sure. So the next item that you're going to be using in this exploration is known as a cross staff and quadrant. And this is a device that allows you to kind of take another triangulation and measure the angles between the horizon or the stars, and basically this could then triangulate your latitude and your position, which is actually a pretty cool technique and pretty rudimentary, but it gets the job done as far as your exploration goes. And if you want to follow, if you know your latitude, you can follow this latitude heading in an east or west bearing and know that you're going in a relatively straight direction. So the ship that was being used in this age of exploration is known as a caravel. And this was a ship that was, improved upon and designed by the Portuguese under Henry the Navigator that were really charting the western coast of Africa. And it is, as I say here, it's a sturdy ship that typically has 3 or 4 masts. So these big masts are these big poles and these ships that hold up the sails. And they use these lateen sails, which we're going to be talking about just in just a second, that allow them to be able to travel in different directions on the ocean based off of the wind. It really becomes it's a pretty fast and maneuverable ship, and it's going to be really important in this traveling across the oceans. As I just mentioned, the lateen sails are going to be what is placed on in these caravels. And a lateen sail is essentially a triangular sail that is it's maneuverable or kind of around the mast a little bit. But one thing that allows it to do is it allows you to actually manipulate how the boat catches the wind. And what that allows is being able to take advantage of the wind from most angles. So you, at this point, don't just need a wind coming from your back to make you go a certain direction. You can kind of go in this zigzagging kind of motion, picking up the wind, being able to actually go the direction you want to go, even if the wind isn't necessarily always favorable. And that's really important because while you're out in the ocean, obviously you're not going to always get that favorable wind. So some of the first really explorers that we're going to be talking about are Vikings. They are a Norse people. They come from modern day Scandinavia, so Sweden, Finland, and Norway area. And ultimately, these people were some of the best sailors in Europe at this time, right around the years 800 to about 1,000 or so. And these people were really good out on the water and on the sea. And in doing so, they're actually going to start kind of heading westward and colonizing in Iceland and Greenland, and ultimately setting up settlements in the New World as well. Hundreds of years really before Christopher Columbus. So Leif Erikson is the one that is ultimately setting up a settlement in modern-day Newfoundland in Canada. The settlement's known as Vinland or Vineland, and he wasn't necessarily the first modern European anyway to see the new land. Some of the Viking exploration journeys had kind of seen it beforehand, but he's the first one to actually set up this temporary settlements in the New World. There's tons of speculation about what might have happened to the settlement in the New World. Some people say that they might have been driven out by Native Americans, or just simply that the land wasn't really super hospitable, and that's why they didn't, stick. But ultimately, these people, these Vikings, were in the New World significantly longer before Columbus, almost 500 years longer. And here is a map of these journeys. So you can see the journeys of Eric the Red and some of these other Viking expeditions as well, kind of around in the same area. It kind of shows how Eric the Red was able to help, colonize into Iceland and Greenland, essentially. And then Eric's son, Leif Erikson, is Eric the Red's son, and he's going to kind of continue this westward after some initial other Viking explorations. And obviously, you're going to have a little bit more Viking exploration a little bit after Leif Erikson as well, but ultimately this is kind of the end of that, and the settlements in the New World don't last. So we're going to skip Columbus a bit here, just because, again, we've already covered him in quite a bit of detail in our last unit, but our next kind of person we're going to be talking about is Vasco de Gama, who is one of these Portuguese sailors. He makes his journey in 1497, again sailing for Portugal, and he is important because he's ultimately the first European to reach India by sea, going around Africa. So he goes around Africa. He goes past and around the Cape of Good Hope, which is the very southern tip of Africa in would be modern day South Africa. And he heads up and heads to India, proving that it can be done, and that it might be a profitable thing for trade, obviously, in the future. And that's obviously pretty important for the exploration heading toward that part of the world. And now the question is ultimately, is it possible to get to the Indies? heading west? Is it not? They don't really know quite yet at this point. They obviously know there's some land to the west that's not necessarily the Indies, but they're trying to figure out exactly which is the best way to go still at this point. So our next person we're talking about is a man named Amerigo Vespucci, and he is an Italian navigator who ultimately visits the New World after Columbus. He really was more of an observer on his expeditions, but on the expeditions he was on, he ultimately wrote some pretty extensive accounts of what he saw in the New World. From at least 2 voyages, there's disputes of that possibly he was there for more than 2, up to 4 voyages after Columbus, and the big thing is that he is part of the voyage that is really discovering the true size of these American continents. They realize that South America is quite a bit larger than it had thought to be, and they haven't been able to find a way through. So he is one of the first people to really think that this might just be a complete new continent all by itself. And Amerigo Vespucci here is really famous because ultimately this is where America gets its name. A German cartographer named Martin, I believe it's pronounced Waldseemüller, he in creating this Waldseemüller map, he uses Amerigo Vespucci's notes and ultimately creates a map labeled, in certain landmass for the first time, in the West, that is a separate continent, and he ultimately puts America as part of the name, after Amerigo Vespucci, and you're going to see that map here in just a second. So this is the map that Waldseemüller made. I can zoom in a little bit, but it's pretty accurate as far as Africa and Europe goes, where I'm circling with my mouse. Even Saudi Arabia right here, and around the Red Sea is pretty accurate for sure. It obviously gets a little less accurate as you head farther east. I don't know really where India would be here. This is going to be Southeast Asia. They don't really have Australia here. No real Japan. They just have a bunch of islands in the Pacific here, obviously. They're not sure of really what it looks like as far as the mapping goes. The Europeans are anyway. The Chinese and such would probably have much better maps, but they didn't have access to them, obviously. But when you head west, you now have some sort of landmass being drawn here that represents the American continents, right? They're not really quite sure how large they are. They don't really know the shape of them, but this is for the first time the first depiction of a landmass that is believed to be its own separate entity and now not part of Asia. And that's why this map is a big deal, and that's why Amerigo Vespucci, and that's why I guess how America gets its name, because if you look really closely up here, you can kind of see where it says America, but you can't really read it because of the resolution of the map, but that's where it gets its name anyway. The next important part of this story of kind of the Age of Exploration is this thing that's known as the Treaty of Tordesillas. The Pope at the time was a Spaniard, and at this time, the church was a very, very powerful entity, and many of the Christians in Europe ultimately believed that the Pope had some authority to actually divide up the newly discovered lands among certain Christian nations, certain Christian groups and countries. And with the Pope being Spanish, the new land was going to ultimately be drawn up in kind of favor of Spain in drawing the line. So the Pope draws a line, and ultimately there's a bit of a treaty and a negotiation between the countries that is made at this Treaty of Tordesillas. You're going to see the map here in a second of where those lines are drawn. So this is the map of the lines. The line, in this dotted line here where my mouse is the dotted line, or the line that the Pope drew, Pope Alexander, and ultimately just a year later or so, you have this treaty negotiations that pushes the line a little farther west, and basically everything west of this line now is going to be open for Spanish control and Spanish conquest here, whereas everything east of the line is going to end up being Portuguese. But there was no real western boundary of this. So that you get another treaty, 30 years later or so, really 36 30, my math is off here, 37 years later, that draws the other boundary, and that's ultimately why the Portuguese are exploring Africa here, and around Africa, to the Indies, whereas the Spanish are kind of heading west into the new land. But if modern day, if you go down to modern day South America, if you think about it, Brazil today, which is kind of right where my mouse is, where I'm circling, is Portuguese. So you can actually see the effects of this line drawn, hundreds of years ago and today. It's really pretty cool. We're going to be talking about a few of our Spanish explorers now. You have, first things first, you have Vasco Núñez de Balboa, and he is going to kind of be a little bit ahead of some of the Spanish conquests in the New World. Cortez is 1519, Pizarro is in the 1530s, so this is, 1513 here, and it is a trip by the Spanish, and particularly this man, to basically across the Isthmus of Panama, which is where I'm pointing with my mouse, which an isthmus is a small, narrow section of land that connects two much larger continents, obviously between oceans or seas here as well. So the fact that it's a small, narrow strip makes this the perfect spot to travel across because it's very narrow, and it's only roughly 45 miles of a trip of what he was able to go through. It took a while. It was really dense, rainforest jungle, but ultimately Balboa is the first European, I should say, to discover the Pacific Ocean and see the Pacific Ocean for himself. Next, you have a man named Ferdinand Magellan in about 1519. He takes a 3-year journey, and he's not going to actually live throughout the whole journey, but his trip anyway, and his journey, expedition, voyage, whatever you want to call it, is the first journey to circumnavigate the globe. Magellan is kind of still following in Columbus's footsteps here and believes that you're going to be able to travel to the Indies faster by going west. So he proposes this trip to the king. It gets accepted, and he ultimately works his way all the way around South America. He goes through the southern tip of South America. There's a little section that separates from the mainland, which is known as the Strait of Magellan. Now, because that's the way he went, he didn't really have any idea how large the Pacific Ocean was, and continues on. It's a very, very large ocean, but when you go, you can see the route he takes. So this is the route he's taking. He winters down here, or takes some time, and then heads all the way across the Pacific Ocean. Ultimately, because of a bit of a dispute in the Philippines with some of the locals, Magellan is killed. And only one ship is actually going to make it all the way around the world. But this just shows that it is possible to make it all the way around the globe. It's a pretty impressive feat, obviously, at the time, and that's Ferdinand. So another one of these Spanish conquistadors, if you will, is a man named Francisco de Coronado, and he takes a voyage, a trip, really, expedition into the heart of the southwest United States. Ultimately, he's looking for treasure and other things, potentially a potential Northwest Passage as well. There's still hope that this exists, that you can get through the American continents. Ultimately, his expedition is kind of responsible for finding the Grand Canyon. They claim and conquer, a bit of this land for Spain. There's this mythic cities of gold, Cibola, that he is supposedly conquering as well, but it's not quite what they thought it was, and at least as far as the myth and legend went, as far as a city of gold anyway. You also have a man named Hernando de Soto, basically taking his trip at pretty much the exact same time as Coronado. De Soto had actually been with Francisco Pizarro in Peru, just years earlier, and really he wanted to find his own glory in the New World, and doing so, he goes through Florida and kind of travels all the way around the southeast United States. You can see kind of his route here, ultimately until his death. He wanders around basically looking for this gold, looking for these cities, these new empires you could potentially conquer, and it's a 4-year trip. He never really finds what he's looking for, and ultimately dies in the process. But it's still claiming a ton of land for Spain in the New World, and potentially making some enemies with the natives as he goes too. So you also have a English expedition going out around this time. A man named John Cabot, who is the first person to sail for England to head into the New World, right? Once Spain had done this, the word travels around the world that, this is what they found, and everyone kind of wants to get a piece of the pie here. So this is England's, first major attempt here. You have John Cabot. He heads west, looking for this potential Northwest Passage. He ends up running into Newfoundland, right around where Leif Erikson was discovering, about 500 years earlier. The trip was actually pretty quick just because of where it's located. It gets pretty narrow up at the northern latitude, so he's able to make this trip in really only 11 weeks, which is pretty cool. And he's starting to claim land in Canada now for England. And that's obviously pretty important too as we move later into the ball game. You also get France joining the mix here. One of the first big French explorers here, or at least sailing for France anyway, is a man named Giovanni da Verrazzano, who makes his trip in 1524. He is ultimately going to explore the Atlantic coast, and he is responsible for discovering the New York harbor. And this is pretty much the reason why the bridge that spans the length of the harbor, the New York harbor, between Brooklyn and Staten Island, is actually named after him. So if you look at the map here, this is a map of his journey. You can kind of see the arrow pointing which way it goes. So he ultimately lands in kind of South Carolina area, potentially northern Georgia there, and heads up the coast. He heads into the New York harbor right here. He works his way across the Long Island Sound, and then ultimately works his way back to Europe. As another Frenchman, you get a man named Jacques Cartier, who discovered ultimately the St. Lawrence River, and this is a water route that goes a pretty good deal into the interior of North America. He follows the St. Lawrence River all the way down, past modern-day Quebec, and pretty much to modern-day Montreal, and you can see that on this map right here. He basically follows it all the way in before he, heads back out and heads back toward France. But this is important because they're looking for a way for a potential Northwest Passage, and to them, this is as far inland as you're pretty much getting so far, and that's obviously a good step to them. It's going to allow you to get into the interior for trade, dealing with these Native Americans. Remember that the French are going to have a very different mantra compared to the Spanish, who are conquering everyone. The French are kind of saying hello to everyone. They're meeting everyone. They're setting up trade with all these different Native Americans. They're much more hospitable people and much more willing to trade with these people versus the Spanish, who are kind of going in and being like, oh, you're not going to convert to Christianity? I'm sorry, I guess that means you're not really a person, and that we have the right to conquer you. The French have a very different take, obviously, and that's going to be important because this is going to become a major hub and major route for trade of furs with these Native Americans and for the French fur trappers that are going to be following into this area now. And our last explorer that we are going to be talking about happens quite a bit later, in between 1609 and 1611. You have a explorer that is basically sailing for the Netherlands at first, and then he actually makes his second voyage for England, but his main voyage, his first voyage, is for the Netherlands. Don't get this flag up here confused as the French. It's a different orientation of the flag. You can go back in the video to see the difference if you'd like. But anyway, so Henry Hudson is the first one to explore really deeply into the modern-day New York metropolitan area. He travels up the Hudson River and gets as far as modern-day Albany. And past that, the river gets a lot more treacherous. You have a lot more rapids and things, and the ships wouldn't really be able to make it. But he's ultimately doing this for the Dutch East India Trading Company, looking to potentially set up possible, trading outposts and things like that for the company, to make it profitable, obviously, for them, and scouting out potential areas for them to operate. And this is ultimately why New York, which was originally known as New Amsterdam, is going to fall to Dutch control as part of New Netherlands when we start talking more about our colonization coming up. His second trip is more in northern Canada, and he discovers what is today known as Hudson Bay, where they kind of get up there and they wait for this winter to be over, when it starts to break up, they kind of get on their way again, but I guess the crew is not really happy anymore, and they want to return home. Hudson isn't really for that, supposedly, and the crew ultimately mutinies. They actually leave Hudson and a few of the crew members adrift in the Hudson Bay, and that's actually the last you ever hear of Henry Hudson. But here is a map of these voyages. So the first one, you can see Hudson's trip coming in here. He heads up the Hudson River to about Albany right here. He heads back out, back to his home. And the next journey is going to come up here into the northern, again, territories in Canada here in the Hudson Bay, before, he gets sent adrift in this mutiny, and that is the last you ever hear of him. So that's really all the explorers we're going to be talking about heading into the colonization unit that we are going to be looking at next. So thank you for listening.